Now naturally, the safety and prosperity that exists almost uniquely in Western countries is an irresistible magnet. These blessings, though, are not the accidents of history, but the product of values painstakingly discerned and refined, and of practices carefully cultivated and reinforced over hundreds of years. Implicitly or explicitly, the imperative to love your neighbour as you love yourself is at the heart of every Western polity. It expresses itself in laws protecting workers, in strong social security safety nets, and in the readiness to take in refugees. It's what makes us decent and humane countries as well as prosperous ones. But right now, this wholesome instinct is leading much of Europe into catastrophic error. All countries that say anyone who gets here can stay here are now in peril, given the scale of the population movements that are starting to be seen. There are tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of people living in poverty and danger who might readily seek to enter a Western country if the opportunity is there. And who could blame them? Yet no country or continent can open its borders to all comers without fundamentally weakening itself. And this is the risk that the countries of Europe now run through misguided altruism. Now, on a somewhat smaller scale, Australia has faced the same predicament and overcome it. The first wave of illegal arrivals to Australia peaked at 4,000 people a year back in 2001, before the Howard government first stopped the boats by processing illegal arrivals offshore, by denying them permanent residence, and in a handful of cases by turning illegal immigrant boats back to Indonesia. The second wave of illegal boat people was running at the rate of 50,000 a year and rising fast by July 2013, when the Rudd government belatedly reversed its opposition to offshore processing, and then my government started turning boats around, even using orange lifeboats when people smugglers deliberately scuttled their vessels. I'm pleased to say that it's now 18 months since a single illegal boat has made it to Australia. The immigration detention centres have all but closed. Budget costs peaking at $4 billion a year have ended. And best of all, there are no more deaths at sea. That's why stopping the boats and restoring border security is the only truly compassionate thing to do. And because Australia once more has secure borders, and because it's the Australian government rather than people smugglers that now controls our refugee intake, there was actually massive public support for my government's decision just last month to resettle 12,000 members of persecuted minorities from the Syrian conflict, which per capita is the biggest resettlement contribution that any country has made. Now, while Prime Minister, I was loath to give public advice to other countries whose situations are different. But because people smuggling is a global problem, and because Australia is the only country that's successfully defeated it twice under Conservative governments, our experience should be studied. In Europe, as with Australia, people claiming asylum invariably have crossed not one border but many, and are no longer fleeing in fear, but are contracting in hope with people smugglers. However desperate, almost by definition, they're economic migrants because they had already escaped persecution when they decided to move again. Our moral obligation is to receive people fleeing for their lives. It's not to provide permanent residency to anyone and everyone who would rather live in a prosperous Western country than their own. That's why the countries of Europe, while absolutely obliged to support the countries neighbouring the Syrian conflict, are more than entitled to control their own borders against those who are no longer fleeing a conflict but seeking a better life. This means turning boats around for people coming by sea. It means denying entry at the border for people with no legal right to come. And it means establishing camps for people who currently have nowhere to go. It will require some force. It will require massive logistics and expense. It will gnaw at our consciences. Yet it is the only way to prevent a tide of humanity surging through Europe and quite possibly changing it forever. We are, in fact, rediscovering the hard way that justice tempered by mercy is an exacting ideal, as too much mercy for some necessarily undermines justice for all. Now, the Australian experience proves that the only way to dissuade people seeking to come from afar is not to let them in. Working with other countries and international agencies is important, but the only way to stop people trying to gain entry is firmly and unambiguously to deny it, out of the moral duty to protect one's own people and to stamp out people smuggling. So it's good that Europe has now deployed naval vessels to intercept people smuggling boats in the Mediterranean. But as long as they're taking passengers aboard rather than turning boats around and sending them back, it is a facilitator rather than a deterrent.